A young black pilot walks into the airport for what should have been the proudest day of his life, his first official shadow day after earning a coveted spot in an elite aviation program. But within minutes, everything spirals. A veteran captain, blinded by prejudice, accuses him of trespassing, shoves him against a hangar wall, and calls security, ignoring the badge in his hand and the dream in his heart. What happens next? He's paraded through the terminal in cuffs, humiliated before hundreds, and nearly erased from the very future he worked so hard to build. But just 7 hours later, a single phone call flips the entire story on its head, and the captain finds himself answering for far more than he ever expected. You won't believe how deep this injustice went or who showed up to fight back. Stay with me, because this is the kind of story that rattles your bones and stirs your spirit. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, because no matter where you are, this is a moment we all need to witness. And if this story moves you even half as much as it moved us, hit that subscribe button. We've got more real stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. Jamal Carter woke up before the sun even thought of rising, eyes wide open like a boy who'd just been handed the keys to the sky. At 16, his dreams weren't stitched from fairy tales or late-night television. They were sewn from jet engines, graphite sketches of cockpits, and the soft hum of possibility. He sat at the kitchen table in their modest Dallas home, the kind of place where the wallpaper curled slightly at the corners and the linoleum floors held echoes of long-held family laughter. In his trembling hands was a white envelope, crisp as new snow, and inside it a golden ticket. Not to some chocolate factory, but to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, where he'd been selected to shadow a real-life pilot for the day. This wasn't luck. This was the fruit of midnight study sessions, equations scribbled in the margins of second-hand notebooks, and a mind that could name every plane by the sound of its engines. His mother, Lena, moved quietly behind him, fingers braiding his hair with the same careful rhythm she used to thread hope into their days. "You keep staring at that paper, fly boy," she said with a warm chuckle. "You're gonna miss the plane." But Jamal didn't even blink. He was flying already, not with wings, but with purpose. Across the room, his father, Marcus, leaned against the kitchen counter in a navy blue shirt, coffee in hand, phone buzzing every few minutes with the silent rhythm of a life built from responsibility. He caught Jamal's eye and gave him that slow, quiet nod, the kind of fatherly nod that doesn't say good luck, but I see you, and I believe in you. And if you've ever raised a child or watched a grandchild find their spark, you know that nod. You've done it yourself when the training wheels came off, or they walked into that first job interview. You've seen that mix of fear and fire in their eyes, and maybe, just maybe, it reminded you of your younger self, the version of you that dared to dream before the world told you to shrink. That morning, Jamal left the house like a boy on a mission. Backpack slung over one shoulder, his acceptance letter zipped safely beside a sketchbook full of airplane controls and engine blueprints. The drive to the airport wasn't long, but it stretched like forever. The Texas sun had already begun to bake the road, and as his mom's old sedan rolled toward the terminal, the air inside felt heavy with both pride and the weight of possibility. Before he stepped out, Lena reached across and squeezed his hand. "Make us proud, baby," she said. And there it was, the benediction of every mother who's ever sent her child into a world not built for them. Now, maybe you're reading this and thinking about your own firsts. Your first big break. The first time you walked into a room where you weren't sure you belonged. Let Jamal remind you, it's not about fitting in. It's about showing up with the full weight of your story, standing tall even when the world would rather you stayed seated. And if you've still got breath in your lungs, and I know you do, remember that your voice, your belief still matters. Speak life into the next generation. Say to them what Marcus said with a look. You're ready. Say to them what Lena said with her hands. Go be great. Because when you believe in a young person, you don't just give them confidence, you give them lift. You give them wings. And Jamal? Jamal was already flying. Jamal stepped into the airport like a boy stepping into a dream, made real glass walls stretching upward like cathedrals of motion, polished floors that mirrored the world he'd imagined since he was 6, and the steady rhythm of announcements that sounded like the heartbeat of possibility. He clutched his badge like a passport to destiny, the plastic cool in his fingers, his name printed clean beneath the Lone Star Airlines logo, a seal that told the world he belonged here. A staffer named Ms. Torres greeted him with the sharp efficiency of someone who kept the skies running, clipboard in one hand, a no-nonsense smile in the other, and led him through the humming arteries of the airport, past coffee stands and security checkpoints, to a steel door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Behind that door, Hangar B. Inside, a Boeing 737, sleek and silver like something pulled straight from the pages of his notebook. The jet sat like a resting dragon, still but powerful, and when Jamal stepped inside, it was like walking into the pages of his own dream. Ms. Torres gave him a bright yellow vest, oversized, but he wore it like a captain's coat and told him his mentor was running a little late. "Feel free to look around," she said, and walked off into the maze of mechanics and metal. And so Jamal did what any kid full of wonder and courage might do. He stepped closer to the cockpit, his sneakers whispering against the hangar floor, and reached out. Just a fingertip, just a moment, tracing the edge of the throttle he'd memorized from books and blueprints. If you've ever visited a place that once lived only in your imagination, a childhood home, a battlefield from your grandfather's war stories, a church where generations of your family knelt, then you know that feeling. It's not just awe, it's recognition. But dreams, as you know too well, don't always wait politely. They are delicate things, easily bruised by the world's harder truths. And that truth walked in wearing a pilot's uniform with 4 gold stripes and a storm behind his pale blue eyes. Captain Victor Hensley entered the hangar like a man born to own it, tall, rigid, every inch of him built from sky hours and silent judgments. He didn't smile, didn't ask questions. He saw Jamal standing near the cockpit and moved like thunder. Fast, sharp, uninvited. Before the boy could explain, before he could even breathe, Hensley's voice cut through the metal echo of the hangar, low, mean and steady. "Who let this kid in here?" It wasn't curiosity. It was accusation. And then it got worse. A shove against the chest. A fistful of vest fabric twisted in a grip like iron. A boy pinned against a wall meant to hold planes, not teenage dreams. Jamal tried to speak. "I'm with the program, sir." He held up his badge like a shield, like proof of his right to stand there. But Hensley didn't look at the badge. He looked at Jamal's skin, his braids, and then said words no child should ever hear. "Your kind doesn't belong near my planes. Maybe you're thinking this can't happen, not today, not in a world we've worked so hard to change. But if you've lived long enough, and I know you have, then you know that the old poisons hide well in new uniforms. So here's what I'll ask of you. Remember the times you were silent when you should have spoken. Then decide to speak now. If you've ever believed in fairness, in earned opportunity, in judging a person not by their look but by their effort, then don't let this kind of moment pass quietly. Speak up. Write a letter. Tell someone younger that you see them, that they belong. Because in that hangar, a boy with a badge and a heart full of hope was reduced to a threat, simply because he dared to stand in a place someone else decided was too high for him to reach. And that is not the America you raised your children in. That is not the legacy you want to leave. Let Jamal remind us. Opportunity must not only be given, it must be protected. Especially when it shakes in the hands of a child holding a badge against a storm. They dragged him through the terminal like he was luggage someone had tried to sneak past security, wrists cuffed, vest crooked, eyes wide with disbelief. Jamal Carter, a child with a passion in his chest and a badge in his pocket, found himself paraded through glass and steel like a warning instead of a witness. Around him, the airport pulsed with everyday life, travelers sipping coffee, kids glued to iPads, announcements echoing through the air. But for Jamal, the world had tilted, and now he walked through it sideways. Captain Hensley followed close behind, his voice louder than justice, pointing at Jamal like he was something broken that needed removal. "This is what happens when we let them slip through," he declared, and the crowd parted, not out of kindness but out of fear, like Jamal was contagious, like his dreams had dirt on them. Cell phones came out, flashes popped. Some looked away, others stared. Not one voice rose in defense. And if you're old enough to remember the first time you saw someone wrongly accused, You know the chill that comes from watching a lie take root while truth stands alone. The guards marched Jamal to the center of the plaza, a bright, open space made for moving forward, now turned into a spotlighted stage for humiliation. He stood there, his hands behind his back, cuffed like a criminal. He had no weapon, no record, no plan to sabotage anything except generational doubt. All he carried was the name of a program that believed in him, and the memory of his parents' faith wrapped around him like armor now turning to ash. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A boy pointed. Someone whispered, "Gang." All because he stood there in skin they feared and ambition they didn't understand. Maybe you think this doesn't happen anymore. Maybe you believe the law is fair, that hard work is enough, that the world has moved on from these ghosts. But I tell you now, ghosts wear badges and smiles too. And if you've lived through the 60s, if you've marched or watched others march on black and white TVs, then you know what Jamal felt: shame that wasn't his, a public silence louder than any riot. And here's the truth, wrapped not in poetry but in plain reality. A crowd that does not speak is a crowd that consents. If you were there, would you have said something? Would you have stepped forward, even with trembling hands, and said, "Wait, let the boy speak"? Because we still can. Maybe not in that terminal, but in the schools we fund, the programs we vote for, the conversations we start at kitchen tables or church potlucks. When we see a young person being punished not for what they've done but for who they are, we are given a choice: comply with our silence or confront with our voice. Jamal stood trembling under the glare of 1,000 wrong assumptions, his braids falling over his eyes like curtains trying to shield him from the show. He wasn't just humiliated, he was dehumanized, turned into an example for a fear that had nothing to do with facts. The crowd saw a story they'd been told before and forgot to ask if it was true. If you ever wondered how injustice hides in plain sight, this is how. It walks a boy into a dream, shoves him to the ground, and calls it safety. And so I ask you, when you see it next time, and you will, don't just feel uncomfortable. Interrupt. In your words, your votes, your letters, your lessons to your grandkids. The cost of silence is far too high, and no child's dignity should ever be the price. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into Jamal's wrists like a cruel reminder that sometimes, even when you do everything right, the world finds a way to say you don't belong. He sat in that holding room, chained to a bench like a threat, his yellow vest once a badge of honor now stained with dust and disbelief. Across from him, 2 security guards leaned against the wall with the easy posture of men who'd already made up their minds. One muttered something about troublemakers, the other about kids these days, their words floating through the air like ash, careless but burning. Jamal tried again. He spoke the truth slowly, respectfully, the way his father had taught him when navigating spaces not built for them. "Miss Torres gave me the badge. I was invited." But his words hit the walls and fell flat. No one moved to check. No one even reached for the phone. And maybe you've been there, not in a holding room, perhaps, but in a moment where your truth was too inconvenient for someone else's comfort. Maybe it was the job you were passed over for. Maybe it was the time your grandson was followed through a store for no reason except the color of his hoodie. Maybe it was the story you didn't tell because you knew they wouldn't believe it. That's the ache Jamal felt. Not just fear, but the ache of being unheard. Of watching your proof, your badge, your word, get discarded like it never mattered. And when the guards finally came to move him, it wasn't gentle. They grabbed him, twisted his arms behind his back, and shoved him through the corridors of that airport like he was something to be removed, not someone to be protected. He stumbled past travelers who didn't see a boy, they saw a stereotype fed by headlines and ignorance. Phones came out again, and not one voice asked, "Is he okay?" That silence is its own kind of violence. They took him to a back room, dark and windowless, and left him there like a question no one wanted to answer. The flickering bulb above buzzed like a broken promise, and Jamal sat in that light, not as a criminal, but as a child trying to hold on to his dignity. And that's what I need you to understand. This wasn't about trespassing. This wasn't about safety. This was about how quickly fear can turn into force, and how often black and brown boys are made to feel like threats before they're even allowed to feel like students. It's about the deep, hidden systems that still whisper old lies in new uniforms. And here's where your voice matters. Because I know you remember a time when you had to choose to sit quietly or stand loudly. And you know what silence costs. You know what happens when good people say, "It's not my place." It becomes someone else's prison. If you're reading this and you've ever told your grandchildren to do the right thing, even when it's hard, then live that lesson too. Call your representatives. Fund the programs that give kids like Jamal a way in. Speak up when someone at church or the dinner table tells the kind of joke that cuts deeper than it sounds. Because Jamal wasn't just locked in that room, he was locked out of his future. For doing everything right. For carrying a dream. For walking into a space he'd earned access to. So let this chapter be your reminder. The fight for justice isn't over. And if your voice still has strength, it still has a purpose. Use it. While there are still boys waiting in rooms like that, hands cuffed, heads bowed, clinging to hope that someone, somewhere, will believe them. Marcus Carter didn't knock when he entered the police station. He didn't have to. He walked in like a storm on two legs, shoulders squared, eyes lit with a quiet fury that comes only when a father has heard that his son was chained for dreaming too big in the wrong skin. His suit was sharp, his voice sharper, and every word he spoke carried the weight of a man who had spent his life earning authority in a system that never truly welcomed him. "I want my son," he said, steady as steel. And though the officers shifted uncomfortably, made calls, whispered behind glass, no one could ignore that name. Marcus Carter, senior official at the FAA, a man who'd inspected more planes than some of those guards had ever flown on. He wasn't just a father. He was the system they trusted but now turned against them. And that's the irony, isn't it? That power listens when it wears the right tie, the right title, the right tone. But what if Marcus hadn't been FAA? What if he'd just been dad, and nothing more? Jamal might still be in that room, his future leaking away like fuel on tarmac. But Marcus was more than a title. He was prepared. He brought records, footage, statements. He called in Ms. Torres, who confirmed what Jamal had tried to shout through tears and steel. The badge was real. The invitation was earned. And the only lie in the hangar was the one Hensley shouted with a smirk. So the tide began to turn, not because hearts had changed, but because Marcus made the system remember its own paperwork. And isn't that something we all know too well? That sometimes the truth only matters if it's typed, stamped, notarized. Still, he got his boy out. Not with violence, but with precision. Not with begging, but with undeniable facts. He wrapped his arm around Jamal as the cuffs came off. His grip not gentle but grounding. And if you've ever been the kind of parent or grandparent who showed up when others backed down, you know that kind of grip. The one that says, "You are not alone. You are not broken. And we are not done." They walked out into the sunlight, not as heroes, but as survivors of something that should never have happened. And maybe you're asking, what now? What do we do when the injustice is named, but not yet punished? We double down. We document. We speak. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the FAA before the sun went down, and he didn't stop there. He contacted reporters. He leaked the video of Jamal being shoved like baggage. He called every pilot he knew and said, "If this can happen to my son, it can happen to yours." And here's where you come in, not just as a witness to this story, but as a participant in what comes next. If you have a platform, use it. If you vote, vote like your grandchildren's dignity depends on it. If you're tired of watching history repeat itself, say so, out loud, in letters, in board meetings, at reunions. Because the truth is, Marcus couldn't change the past, but he could make sure the future remembered. And so can we. That day, a father showed up with facts. A boy walked free though wounded. And a system shaken by the voice of one man who refused to stay quiet, had no choice but to listen. That's not the end of the story. It's just the part where hope gets its second wind. Let it breathe through you. Let it speak through you. Let it move you to action before another child has to be rescued for daring to reach too high. It should have ended their father and son walking out of that police station. Back straight, dignity bruised but intact, the truth slowly rising like morning light through a dirty window. But cruelty, when threatened, doesn't retreat, it evolves. And Victor Hensley wasn't done. Not after being exposed. Not after Marcus dared to speak his name into headlines and boardrooms. He came back like a storm that wouldn't stay buried, with threats that slithered through phone lines and warnings that arrived not with evidence, but with fear. Jamal had barely begun to breathe again when the call came. Hensley, on the other end of the line, voice low and rusted, issued a challenge disguised as a threat. "Meet me," he said, "or your father pays the price." And just like that, the world tilted again. Marcus told Jamal to stay home, to let the law work, but Jamal had lived enough injustice for a lifetime, and in that moment, he understood something ancient. Sometimes you don't wait for the system to save you. You become the system that says no more. So they went, together, to a gas station just off the interstate, the kind of place where hope flickers in buzzing neon and the scent of oil clings to the air like memory. Hensley was there, standing beneath a flickering canopy light, dressed in black, a gun glinting like a broken promise in his hand. It was no longer about badges or accusations. This was personal now, a man trying to rewrite the ending by force. Marcus moved first, shielding Jamal with a body built from years of carrying burdens too heavy for one man. But Hensley moved too fast, desperate, and struck. The butt of the gun caught Jamal at the temple, and the world exploded into a whirl of stars and gravel. Blood, hot and thick, traced down his cheek, but he didn't fall. He stood. He stood not just because his legs held him, but because the weight of every injustice he'd carried refused to let him drop. That's when the sirens broke the air like glass. The cops swarmed, weapons drawn, orders shouted into the wind, and Hensley once again was brought to his knees. But as he was cuffed, he didn't scream. He laughed, and that laughter chilled Jamal deeper than the blow to the head. Because what came next wasn't a courtroom or closure, it was chaos. A federal agent ran up, face pale, voice shaking, whispering words that cracked reality in two. Marcus, the real Marcus, had been kidnapped. That the man standing beside Jamal might not be his father at all, but a planted double, a decoy, a distraction. And if you're sitting there thinking this sounds too wild, too dark for daylight, then ask yourself this: how far do people go when they believe they're losing power? How far have you seen them go in your own life, when the truth backed them into a corner? The history books are full of men who'd rather burn down the house than let justice in through the front door. And Hensley, stripped of his title, stripped of his lies, had chosen fire. So Jamal stood at the center of a storm no child should ever be forced to weather. Head bleeding, body trembling, trust splintered. And still, he said, "I'm going to find my father." He didn't wait for orders. He didn't beg for help. He demanded it. From the agents, from the truth, from every adult in that moment who realized the system wasn't just failing, it was under siege. And maybe that's where we come in. Maybe that's where you and I, older now, yes, but not voiceless, must ask ourselves. Are we still willing to fight for what's right when the story gets complicated? When fear knocks at the door wearing a familiar face? Because here's the thing. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is fear with its boots on, walking toward the fight anyway. That's what Jamal did. That's what Marcus taught him. And that's what you can still teach by how you vote, by how you speak up at City Hall or speak truth at Sunday service, by how you look a young person in the eye and say, "I've got your back." This isn't just Jamal's story anymore. It's ours. And in this chapter, the question is not whether justice is possible. The question is whether we are willing to carry it all the way to the finish line. Even when the road is dark, even when the cost is blood. They drove through the back roads of Dallas like time was running out, and it was. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, ribs aching from too many bruises to count, his temple bandaged, his fists clenched not from fear, but from something deeper, resolve. Marcus was beside him, his father, the real one, wounded but unshaken, a man stitched together by decades of endurance and duty, steering the SUV through the shadows with the kind of focus you only earn from living through storms. The warehouse loomed ahead, rusted and silent, the kind of place where bad things are stored and worse things are hidden. Jamal didn't wait for orders. He didn't hesitate. He moved like a thread pulled tight, heart pounding a beat that said, "This ends here." Inside, the air was thick with gasoline and menace. 3 armed men stood between them, and a bound figure slumped in the center, Marcus's decoy, bruised and gagged, beaten simply for wearing the wrong man's face. And just to the side, as if he hadn't been arrested hours earlier, stood Victor Hensley. Free again. Smirking again. The man refused to stay buried, rising like every lie this country has ever told about who deserves to fly. Hensley raised his pistol, aiming straight at Marcus, but Jamal was faster fueled not by training, but by instinct. He lunged, tackled the captain with everything left in his aching body, fists flying not out of hate, but out of the raw truth that some battles have to be finished with your own hands. They wrestled, grunted. The gun clattered to the floor and slid into Marcus's reach. One militia member dropped from Marcus's bullet. The others fled. The room became smoke and echoes, then silence. Just the sound of Jamal's breath, broken and shallow, and the weight of his father's hand on his back. And if you've ever held a loved one after the worst had passed, the fire put out, the surgery over, the storm cleared, you know that silence. It doesn't ask for words. It just asks for breath. The SWAT team burst in seconds later, too late to fight, but just in time to carry Hensley out in cuffs that were tighter than truth, his face a mask of fury that said, he still didn't believe he'd lost, but he had, in every way that mattered, and still there was no peace. A few days later, a courtroom filled with reporters and lawyers and the kind of polished people who wear bias in their shoes but call it professionalism. The trial was quick. The evidence, overwhelming. Jamal's story was heard. The planted manual, the fake charges, the threats, the attempted murder, all of it laid bare. Hensley was sentenced to life. But just when justice seemed to take a full breath, the wind shifted. Because at a public FAA ceremony meant to honor Jamal's bravery, a forgotten recording crackled to life, a hidden file, a voice from the past. Marcus's voice. I covered it up. Pilot was racist, but I needed the promotion. Just like that, the air in the room turned heavy. The same man who burned it all down for his son had once turned away from the fire when it wasn't his child getting burned. And maybe you've been there. Maybe you've made a choice years ago that you buried, told yourself it was survival, told yourself it didn't matter anymore. But truth doesn't rot, it waits. And when it surfaces, it doesn't ask for permission. Jamal stood frozen on that stage, metal heavy on his chest, pride leaking from the edges of his posture. His father, his hero, cracked in public view. And no one knew what to do. But Jamal did. He stepped off the stage, quietly, deliberately, and walked out into the sun. Because sometimes healing isn't found in the applause. It's found in the silence after. You might be reading this and thinking, what now? What happens when your greatest protector turns out to have once been part of the problem? What do you do when the man who fought for you also failed someone else? You do what Jamal did. You hold both truths. You don't excuse the past, but you don't deny the present. You walk forward with eyes open. Because healing isn't clean. It's layered. And legacy is not just what we inherit, it's what we choose to carry forward. If you've ever stumbled in the fight for justice but got back up, teach that. If you've ever told a hard truth when it cost you something, share that. Because someone like Jamal is listening. And when his feet touch the tarmac again, ready to fly on his own terms, he'll need to know that people like you, older, wiser, tested, didn't stop at the first fall. You got up. Again and again. That's how we win. Not just by surviving the storm, but by refusing to let it teach us to stop walking into the wind. Jamal Carter stood beneath the open sky, that endless Texas blue stretching above him like the dream he once held in his hands, cracked, bruised, but never surrendered. The warehouse was behind him now, the courtroom too, and Victor Hensley finally was gone, buried in a sentence he could no longer escape. But the story hadn't ended when the handcuffs clicked or when the judge's gavel fell like thunder. No, stories like Jamal's never end clean. They echo. They echo in hallways of schools that once doubted him, now hanging his photo on their wall. They echo in pilot lounges where whispers turn into pledges to train the next Jamal, not target him. And they echo in homes like yours and mine where the news flickers on, and we ask ourselves, what would I have done? What can I still do? You see, Jamal didn't just survive. He transformed. Not because the pain didn't matter, it did. Every blow, every lie, Every scar carved into his spirit mattered deeply. But he learned, the way we all must, that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about rebuilding. He accepted the full scholarship Lone Star Airlines offered, but he didn't stop there. He launched a foundation for aviation equity, giving young black and brown kids their own cockpit blueprints, their own wings, their own voices. And when asked to speak at events, he didn't wear his medal like a shield. He wore it like a promise. Not everyone gets a Marcus Carter, he told the crowd once, voice steady. So be one. Be the person who shows up, who fights, who apologizes when they didn't, who speaks when it's risky, and who never stops building bridges in a world too quick to burn them. And now, here's where I turn to you. Yes, you reading this with a few more decades of living etched into your skin. You've seen what Jamal's just learning, that history circles back, that progress is not a staircase but a spiral, and that every generation has a duty to bend the arc a little further toward justice. So I ask you, not gently but urgently, what will you do with the time you have left? Will you mentor a kid who reminds you of Jamal? Will you write your representative and ask what's being done about bias in law enforcement? Will you tell your grandkids the stories you were once too ashamed to share, so they can rise with truth beneath their feet? You are not too old to matter. You are seasoned enough to make it count. This world does not just need the young to rise, it needs the wise to lift. Jamal's journey is proof that systems can be exposed, lies can be undone, and futures can be reclaimed, but not by silence, not by watching, and not by saying, "It's too late for me to help." It is never too late to light a match, to raise a voice, to say to the next Jamal, "You have value not later, but now." So speak his name, carry his fight, share his story at your book club, your community center, your kitchen table. Tell them the truth, that courage is messy, that justice stumbles, but that in the end, it rises. Always, just like Jamal did, just like we still can.